Okay, I am starting the third packet that is reviewing Algebra 1 concepts to get us ready for Algebra 2 next year. This packet is on Google Classroom, so you can print it off and follow along, or just have it up on your computer and follow along, whatever is easiest for you. We're still factoring. Last week we factored when there's 4 numbers or 2 numbers. And this packet is we're going to factor when there are 3 numbers or 3 terms. And we've done a little bit of this during bell work this year, but basically we're using the product and sum. P stands for product, S stands for sum. So you use this again when you have 3 numbers that you need to factor. The product is your first number times your last. 5 times 2 is 10. The sum is the number in the middle, which is 11. Then you have to come up with 2 numbers that multiply to 10, but then those same 2 numbers need to add to give you 11. In this case, it'd be 1 and 10. Because 1 times 10 is 10, and 1 plus 10 is 11. Once you find those numbers, you then have to replace the middle number with these 2 numbers. So I'm going to rewrite this out. I still have the 5x squared, but instead of 11x, I'm going to put 1x and 10x. And then I have the plus 2. So this is what it now looks like when I rewrite it out. A few things. Because we're replacing the middle number and it has x on it, that's why I put x's with the 1 and the 10. And it doesn't matter the order, the 10x will go first and then the 1x. But it is replacing the middle number once you find that pair. Now, if you notice, I now have 4 numbers. So this is going to take us back to what we learned last week when we factored with 4 numbers. When you had 4 numbers, you did it by grouping, which was to put them into 2 groups of 2 and then take the greatest common factor of each group. So that's what I'm going to do here. So in my first one, the biggest number that can go into 5 and 1 is 1. They both have an x, so I bring out the smaller of the 2, which would just be x. And then to figure out what's left over in the parentheses, you divide. 5 divided by 1 is 5. And then I have 2 x's here. I brought one of them out, so that means I have 1 left over. 1 divided by 1 is 1. I have an x here. I brought 1 out. That means there's none left over. So there's my first group factored. Now I'm going to do my second group with the GCF. The biggest number that can go in the 2 and 10 is 2. I don't bring out an x because they both don't have one. And then to figure out what goes in parentheses, I need to divide. So 10 divided by 2 is 5, and you have to bring down that x. 2 divided by 2 is 1. And again, you know you did it right because these should match. So that's one of your answers is the matching pair, 5x plus 1. The other one are your numbers you brought out in front, which would be 1x plus 2. Or you could just say x plus 2. So there's your first one factored. So basically you're factoring it by grouping, but you have to do the step of product and sum first because you're only starting off with 3 numbers. Once you turn it into 4 numbers, then we factor by putting them into groups. Okay, so the second one, I'm going to start off with product and sum. Product's your first times your last. 6 times 5 is 30. The sum is 13. So you got to find 2 numbers that multiply to give you 30, but then those same numbers add to give you 13. In this case, it'd be 10 and 3. Sometimes you're going to have to try a few numbers until you get something that works. And this is your pair because 10 times 3 is 30, and 10 plus 3 is 13. Once you find that pair, you replace the middle number with these 2 new numbers. So I have the 6x squared, but now instead of 13x, I'm going to have 10x and 3x. And then I have the plus 5. And again, you have to put x's with them because you're replacing the x term. Now that I have 4 numbers, I'm going to put them into 2 groups of 2 and take the greatest common factor of each group. So the GCF of 6 and 10, which again means the biggest number that can go into both evenly, is 2. They both have an x, so I'm going to bring out the smaller one, which is just x. And then to figure out what's left in parentheses, I divide. 6 divided by 2 is 3. I have 2 x's here. I brought one out. That means I have 1 left over. 10 divided by 2 is 5. And then I have 1x. I already brought 1x out, so none are left over. Now to do my second group, the GCF of 3 and 5 is 1. I don't need to bring out an x because they both don't have one. So now I'll just divide. 3 divided by 1 is 3, and I have to bring down this x. And then 5 divided by 1 is 5. Now these are matching, which means I did it right. So one of my answers is 3x plus 5. The other one is my numbers out in front, which is 2x and 1. So there's my answer for number 2. Okay, let's do this rectangle one down here. It says 2x squared minus 13x minus 7 is the area of a rectangle. Find the possible dimensions of the rectangle. So if I have a rectangle and I'm finding the area, area is length times width. So I have to find out what the length and the width, those possible dimensions, what they could be. You're basically doing the same thing up here. You're going to factor with product and sum because we have 3 numbers. So I'm going to start off. Product's your first times your last. 2 times negative 7 is negative 14. And then the sum is the middle number, which is negative 13. So now you got to come up with 2 numbers that multiply to give you negative 14, but add to give you negative 13. In this case, it's going to be positive 1 and negative 14. Because 1 times negative 14 is negative 14, and 1 plus negative 13, or sorry, 1 plus negative 14 gives you negative 13. So sometimes you got to figure out like if one of them has to be negative, sometimes both would have to be negative in order for it to work out. But in this case, positive 1 and negative 14 work. So I'm going to take those 2 numbers and replace the middle. So 2x squared, and now instead of 13x, I'm going to put 1x and negative 14x. And then I have the minus 7. Now that I have 4 numbers, I'm going to put them in the 2 groups of 2 and take the greatest common factor of each group. In my first group, the biggest number that can go in the 2 and 1 is 1. They both have an x, so I'm going to bring out an x, the smaller of the 2, which is just x. Then, to figure out what goes on the inside, you divide. 2 divided by 1 is 2. I have 2 x's here. I've brought 1 out. That means I have 1 left over. 1 divided by 1 is 1, and I would have no x's left over because x and x would cancel out. In my second group, the greatest common factor of 14 and 7 is 7. And I need to bring out a negative. If your first number in your parentheses is negative, then you should bring out a negative. I don't bring out an x because they both don't have one. So now when I divide, negative 14 divided by negative 7 is positive 2, and I bring down the x. Negative 7 divided by negative 7 is positive 1. These match, so one of my answers is that matching pair, 2x plus 1. And the other one is the numbers out in front, which would be x minus 7. And those are the possible dimensions for the rectangle. So this is basically factoring when you have 3 numbers. Again, you use product and sum to turn it into 4 numbers, and then you do what we did last week, which is put them in the 2 groups of 2, take the greatest common factor of each group.